Hi, welcome back to Recipes for a Sweet Life. I'm Julia Usher, and today we are making Christmas ornament cookies. I've made Christmas ornament cookies before, mostly using decorations that were directly applied to the contoured cookies, namely frosting sheets and royal icing transfers, but I've never quite made this kind of ornament before. This ornament in particular, this one makes full use of an embossed cookie. There's very little icing on it, so it's a lot more quick to make as compared to my other ornament cookies. I got the idea for it actually when I did some fancy enameled Sugar Veil boxes for a collaboration video way back when, and you might want to check out that video. But in that video, I used the Sugar Veil lace primarily as a decorative element. Here I'm using the Sugar Veil mats to emboss the cookie dough to create this great texture, and then filling in with the Sugar Veil confectionery icing to create this really shiny jewel-like effect on the outside of the ornament. I've got a second ornament here that uses embossed cookie dough as a primary element in the center. I'm not going to talk much about this, but it is stenciled with frosting sheets, and then the frosting sheets are removed, and I have a whole other video that talks about how to stencil contoured objects. So you might check that out. It's an easy extension to go from this ornament to that ornament. So let's get started. Okay, so let's talk about the cookies needed for this project. It's basically a 7-cookie project starting with a 1-inch disc with a 1/4-inch hole in the top that'll be on the top of the ornament, 2 hemisphere cookies that have been embossed with a Sugar Veil lace mat, 2 fancy leaf cookies that I molded in a First Impressions mold. You can use any other molds, however. These will go back to back at the bottom of the ornament, and 2 additional 7/8 to 1/2-inch fluted rounds, which will also be dangling at the bottom of the ornament. To close gaps between ornament pieces, I like to use a few royal icing transfers. And as a reminder, I have a whole video on this subject, but basically royal icing transfers are piped onto acetate, allowed to dry, and then lifted off like so. Let's talk a little bit about how to make the more complicated shapes that go into this project, namely the domes and also the fancy leaf pieces. I'm going to start by rolling out my gingerbread dough. Any other dough will work that doesn't spread a lot. On a well-floured surface, it's important to have it well-floured so that the piece that's been embossed can come off later and be draped over the hemisphere mold. This is the Sugar Veil lace mat. I'm pressing it into the dough without any additional flour. When I can get away with less flour, I will, because flour has a drying effect on the dough, and you'll see that the mat will come off easily without any additional flour. Now rolling once again to make sure I get a nice imprint from that mat, inverting it and peeling off the mat, and ta-da, as you can see. No need for any additional flour. Now I want to cut out a piece. I'm just going to center it on a pattern that I like using a relatively large cutter. I think this is about 4 to 4.5 inches. The dimensions will be in the video description along with all of the ornament dimensions, in fact. But I do like to cut it bigger than the dome over which it will be shaped, which is 3 inches, so that I make sure that it goes all the way around the sides of the dome. So it definitely has to be a little bit larger. And this just demonstrates the importance of flouring the work surface. You want to make sure that piece comes off easily, because if it doesn't, the pattern that you spent all that time embossing will distort and it won't look as pretty as it once did. Gently shaping it over my 3-inch silicone hemisphere mold, just gently pressing it into the sides because I don't want to press out any of that texture that I created. And that's basically it. I've got a whole nother video on contouring cookies, which you can check out as well. Now onto the embossed leaf. I'm using a First Impressions mold, just pressing the dough into the mold, baking in the mold because I find I get the best impressions that way. These will bake at 375, my normal baking temperature, until lightly browned around the edges. Okay, now that those cookies have been baked and cooled, it's time to give them some glitz and glamour for the holiday season, and I'm doing that by spraying them with gold luster spray. I'm using PME brand here because it dries rather quickly without pooling. And I like to elevate my contoured pieces so I can get a nice even coat even along the bottom edge, which is sometimes hard to reach if it's sitting directly on the surface. For the flat cookies, I will spray them directly on the work surface and only on one side since they're going to get sandwiched back to back, but I do like to get the sides of them as well. It's generally better to spray on paper towel, I find, so that the spray does not pool up and the cookie doesn't get soft sitting in a pool of spray. Okay, let's talk about how to get color into these gold domes. I am going to be piping with Sugar Veil rather than royal icing here because it dries super shiny, as you can see here, and I love that effect. I'm simply going to be mixing the powder in a ratio of 2/3 cup powder to 1/3 cup water to create this kind of stretchy texture, which is perfect for piping, and adding coloring at the end, my normal food coloring that I use to color my royal icing. and piping using my handy parchment pastry cone. The other cool thing about Sugar Veil relative to royal icing is it will not crater as much. So even in these tiny holes where there's a tendency for royal icing to sink back in on itself as it dries and crater or create a hole, this icing will stay nice and poofy, as you can see here. I'm using traditional red, green, and white colors, but I'm thinking some untraditional Christmas colors like purple and turquoise could look equally glamorous against the gold. Just going to pipe and fill this all up, following the texture mat pattern as my guide, and let it dry completely. Okay, so I generally like to let my Sugar Veil dry overnight till it's completely dry before I start the assembly process, because as you'll see, one dome will go upside down on its face during the assembly process on bubble wrap, and if the icing's wet, you can mess it up. The other key step is to file the seams down with a microplaner so there's a nice tight fit. I actually did that before any decorating occurred. You can do a little bit more now if you'd like. Just be careful because you don't want to mess up the decorations on the outsides of the dome. The other thing I did was I marked with a black edible food marker the bottom of each dome, and that's just to help with the alignment of the pattern so they match up from front to back of the ornament. You see I've got a mark on each face. Now I'm taking my thick royal icing glue and putting these two pieces together. I've chosen a very thin flat ribbon so that I don't open up a big seam on the sides. I've also created a knot at the top, and that's just an extra safeguard to prevent the ribbon from pulling out when the ornament is hanging. I've chosen a brown royal icing glue to match the dough. You could also use gold here to match the color of the globe. Either would work just fine. Now I'm just getting it well positioned, making sure the ribbon's nicely centered before the icing dries, just doing some fine adjustments. And then I'm ready to go ahead and pipe on a side seam to cover the gap on the sides. It's quite small, but even so, I'm going to fill it with a little bit of gold royal icing to match the color of the globe. And that icing will just allow the border I'm about to place on it to lie that much more evenly. It could lie rather unevenly if I didn't do this. The border I'm putting on is going to be a series of small green beads of beadwork consistency. This is royal icing. I don't want a really hefty border here. I don't want to see it, so I'm just piping a very delicate set of beads. It's very important for these to dry completely before I add the other baubles that'll be hanging off the ends of the ornament. Otherwise, you can smudge the border. Now I'm going to be first placing these two 1-inch discs back to back. They've been iced with green royal icing. I have some other options, some domed pieces that I used on my stenciled ornament, which you'll see in the upper left-hand corner of the video. So there are different ways of doing these baubles. I just chose simple flat ones here. Sandwiching them again with thick royal icing glue, the brown color. And then I'm ready to apply the leaves directly underneath them. For this part of the process, I do like to support them with a little bit of paper towel. Otherwise, they have a tendency to fall off the ribbon or slide down the ribbon. And the paper keeps them up a little bit better. And again, the process is just the same here, sandwiching them with thick royal icing glue. You will notice, though, that I've left a little extra ribbon at the end of the leaf, and that's done on purpose. These pieces do tend to slide off the ribbon, even if they are propped. And so that little extra ribbon at the bottom allows me to pull down on it and push up on the two end pieces so that they're flush against the globe while the icing is still wet. So I can do other adjustments if they happen to slide and push them back into place. If I didn't have that ribbon there, it'd be much more difficult to do. Now I'd let that completely dry before I cut that piece off. So we're going to give it a little bit more time, maybe a half an hour or so before I cut that off. In the meantime, we can place the little bauble on the top. I do like to cover these seams, and that's where my royal icing transfer comes in. You'll see it dried much more dull than the Sugar Veil. So to gloss it up and give it a little more sheen, I'm going to be painting on a little bit of corn syrup. This is just straight up undiluted corn syrup. It will dry rather dry under dry circumstances, but if it's at all humid, it will dry tacky, so just be aware of that. But it does give it a nice luster that's very consistent with the Sugar Veil. Now before picking up this ornament, I want to trim off the extra ribbon, but before I hang it on anything, I do like to give it ample drying time. Hi, I'm back. So these ornaments have been drying overnight. I make sure they dry at least 8 hours for added security before I hang them. I'm going to be hanging them over my Christmas table to create an elegant chandelier, if you will, an elegant and edible chandelier. I hope you'll attempt these ornaments, and certainly do email me with any questions, concerns, or successes. I love to share your photographs of my projects. Happy holidays. Until next video, live sweetly.